The airport was bustling with the usual mix of excitement and exhaustion. Travelers rushed through the terminals, rolling suitcases trailing behind them. Among them was Captain Darius Mitchell, a tall, confident black man in his crisp pilot's uniform. He had just finished a long-haul flight and was now heading home, finally getting a chance to rest after days in the air. As he approached the boarding gate for his connecting flight, he adjusted his cap, nodding politely at a few passengers who recognized his uniform and smiled. Flying had always been his dream, and after years of hard work, he had earned his place in the cockpit. But today he wasn't flying, just another passenger heading home. Darius handed his first-class ticket to the flight attendant, a blonde woman in her mid-40s with a neatly pressed uniform and a name tag that read Susan. She barely glanced at his ticket before her eyes flicked up to meet his. There was a pause, just a second too long to be normal. Then, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her voice laced with something Darius couldn't quite place. "It looks like there's been a mix-up. We don't have any more first-class seats available." Darius frowned, glancing at the ticket in his hand. "That's impossible. I booked my seat weeks ago." Susan gave him a tight smile. "Yes, well, there must have been a last-minute change. You'll have to take a seat in economy." Darius felt a shift in the air around him. A few passengers waiting in line looked over, sensing the tension. He exhaled slowly, keeping his voice calm. "Ma'am, I paid for first class. I'm a pilot myself. I know how seat assignments work." Her smile didn't waver, but her eyes were cold. "I'm sure you do," she said smoothly. "But I have to follow protocol. You'll need to move to the back." The words hung in the air. Move to the back. Darius knew what was happening. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't about protocol. And the way Susan was staring at him, like he didn't belong, confirmed it. A muscle in his jaw tightened. He glanced past her at the first-class section, where a few empty seats were visible. Yet she was insisting there were none left. He could feel the eyes of other passengers on him now, some curious, some uncomfortable. Darius had faced situations like this before. He knew what it was. But the question was, what was he going to do about it? And that's when something unexpected happened. Darius felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had spent years proving himself in the aviation industry, breaking through barriers, earning his stripes, and yet, here he was, being told to move to the back like he didn't belong. He took a slow breath, steadying himself. This wasn't the first time he had felt out of place in his own profession, but it never got easier. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably in line behind him. Some looked away, pretending not to notice. Others stole glances at the confrontation, waiting to see what would happen next. The air felt thick with unspoken words. Darius could feel the pulse in his temples, but he wasn't going to lose his composure. He had learned long ago that raising his voice or showing frustration wouldn't help. "Ma'am," he said, his voice controlled but firm, "I see open seats in first class. I'm not asking for anything extra, just the seat I paid for." Susan's lips tightened. She crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. "Sir, I don't make the rules. I'm just following them." Darius glanced past her toward the first-class cabin again. He caught sight of another flight attendant, a younger woman, standing near the curtain that separated first class from economy. She looked uncertain, her gaze shifting between Darius and Susan. There was something in her eyes, like she knew this wasn't right but didn't dare say anything. Darius turned back to Susan. "I'd like to speak to the captain." Susan's posture stiffened. "The captain is busy preparing for takeoff. There's nothing he can do." Darius knew that wasn't true. As a pilot himself, he understood the chain of command. A captain had the final say on all matters inside the aircraft. If he explained the situation, the captain could easily clear things up. But Susan was blocking that option. For a moment, he considered pushing the issue further. But then he caught sight of something over Susan's shoulder. A man in a dark suit, sitting in first class, watching the exchange with an amused expression. Darius recognized that look. It was the kind of look he had seen before, the look of someone who enjoyed watching people like him being put in their place. A slow realization settled in. This wasn't just about a seat. It was about control. Darius exhaled, his fingers tightening around the handle of his carry-on. He knew he had to be smart about this. He had been in situations like this before, and they never played out well if he reacted emotionally. But that didn't mean he was going to let it slide. "All right," he said finally, keeping his voice even. "I'll take my seat." Susan's expression flickered, like she had expected him to fight harder. But Darius wasn't done. He turned and walked down the aisle, past the first-class section, past the dividing curtain, and into the crowded economy cabin. The energy was different here. Tighter spaces, tired passengers, the sound of babies crying and flight attendants moving quickly through the rows. Darius found his assigned seat, squeezed between two other passengers, and slowly sat down. His shoulders barely fit between the armrests. He let out a slow breath, staring ahead as the realization settled in. This wasn't over. He reached for his phone, discreetly pulling it out to check something. If they thought he would just let this go, they were mistaken. A soft voice broke through his thoughts. "Excuse me, are you a pilot?" Darius turned to his right. A young boy, maybe 10 years old, sat in the aisle seat wide-eyed. His mother, seated next to him, looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "He just gets excited about planes." Darius forced a small smile. "It's all right." He looked at the boy. "Yeah, I am." The boy's eyes lit up. "That's so cool. Do you fly big planes?" Darius nodded. "Do. Just got off a long flight, actually." The boy grinned. "I want to be a pilot when I grow up." Darius felt something stir in his chest. He had been that kid once, full of dreams, never imagining the hurdles that would come with them. He wanted to tell the boy that the sky was limitless, that he could be anything he wanted. But sitting here, crammed into an economy seat he shouldn't be in, he couldn't bring himself to say it. Instead, he just said, "That's a great dream. Keep working hard and you'll get there." The boy beamed. Darius leaned back, trying to shake off the weight of the moment. But his mind was already working. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about something bigger. And then, something happened that made his heart skip a beat. A flight attendant, not Susan but the younger one from earlier, walked down the aisle, glancing around before stopping near his row. She hesitated, then leaned in slightly. "Captain Mitchell," she whispered. Darius looked up, surprised she knew his name. She glanced around as if making sure no one was watching. Then in a hushed voice she said, "I think you should know. Something isn't right about this flight." Darius's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" The flight attendant swallowed hard, lowering her voice even more. "There was no mistake with your seat." She paused, hesitating. "Someone told Susan to move you." Darius felt a cold chill run down his spine. "Who?" he asked. She hesitated, her gaze flickering toward the first-class section. "I can't say," she whispered. "But you need to be careful." Darius stared at her, processing her words. Someone had deliberately ordered him to be moved. But why? Before he could say anything else, she straightened and quickly walked away, disappearing down the aisle. Darius sat still, his mind racing. This wasn't just an act of bias. It was something more. Someone had gone out of their way to make sure he wasn't sitting up front. And now he had to figure out why. Who had been watching him earlier? The man was sipping a drink, his face relaxed, but there was something calculated in the way he carried himself. He wasn't just another passenger. Darius forced himself to breathe evenly. He had been in difficult situations before, but this felt different. There was an intention behind what had just happened, something beneath the surface. And if the flight attendant was warning him, it meant she was scared too. The plane rumbled as the engines powered up, and the captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing their imminent departure. Darius barely registered the words. His focus was elsewhere. He wasn't just another passenger anymore. He was a target. The young boy beside him tugged at his sleeve again. "Hey, Captain." Darius blinked, bringing himself back to the moment. "Yeah, buddy." The boy leaned in as if sharing a secret. "That lady was lying to you, wasn't she?" Darius studied him, surprised. "What makes you say that?" The boy shrugged. "I don't know. She just looked mad when she talked to you. My mom always says when someone looks mad but they smile, they're not telling the truth." Darius glanced at the mother, who gave him an apologetic smile. "He's very observant." Darius chuckled softly, but the boy's words stuck with him. A child had picked up on something the other passengers ignored. The plane began taxiing, and Darius leaned back, staring at the seat in front of him. He needed more information. He wasn't going to just sit there and let someone decide his place. As soon as the plane reached cruising altitude, flight attendants began moving through the cabin, serving drinks. Darius watched Susan closely. She had a different demeanor now, more at ease. Her job was done. She had done what she was told, and she wasn't expecting any pushback. But the younger flight attendant was nervous. She kept glancing in his direction, as if checking to see if he was okay. Darius decided to test something. As Susan passed by, he casually said, "Excuse me." She stopped, her smile automatic. "Yes, sir. I was wondering if I could speak with the captain after the service." Just a quick word. Something flickered in her eyes. Annoyance, hesitation. "The captain doesn't usually meet with passengers." Darius nodded slowly. "Right. Except I'm not just a passenger. I'm a pilot." Susan's smile didn't falter, but there was an edge in her voice now. "I'll see what I can do." She walked off without another word. Darius sighed, knowing she had no intention of passing along his request. But that didn't matter. He was already gathering what he needed. Small pieces of a puzzle that was beginning to form. As the flight continued, Darius became more aware of the energy on board. Something felt off. A few passengers in first class seemed to know each other, exchanging brief glances and quiet words. The man in the suit was at the center of it. The younger flight attendant walked past him again, her steps quick. Darius caught her wrist gently. She stiffened but didn't pull away. "Tell me the truth," he whispered. "Who told Susan to move me?" She swallowed hard. "I can't. Please don't ask me that." Darius let go, his voice calm but firm. "I need to know. I don't want to get you in trouble, but something is going on, isn't it?" She glanced toward the front of the plane, then back at him. "Just be careful," she whispered. And then she was gone. Darius leaned back, his heart pounding. His instincts were screaming now. This wasn't just about race or bias. This was something bigger. And whatever it was, he was right in the middle of it. Darius could feel his pulse in his ears as the flight continued. Every detail around him felt sharper. The quiet murmur of passengers, the hum of the engines, the clinking of glasses in first class. He wasn't just a man who had been wronged anymore. He was in the middle of something bigger, and the pieces were falling into place, whether he liked it or not. The younger flight attendant had warned him, but she was afraid to say more. Susan had made sure he was moved from first class, and the man in the dark suit had been watching him the entire time. Now, first-class passengers were exchanging glances, like they were part of a conversation he wasn't hearing. Darius wasn't the kind of man who jumped to conclusions, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just a coincidence. He needed to act. Slowly, he reached for his phone, keeping his movements natural. He scrolled casually, pretending to be reading something, but his camera was on, angled toward first class. He zoomed in slightly, snapping a quick picture of the man in the suit. Then, he lowered the phone and sent the image to a pilot friend of his, along with a short message. "Something's off. You recognize this guy?" He pressed send and slipped the phone into his lap, pretending to adjust his seatbelt. It would take a while before his friend responded, if the message even went through at this altitude. But at least he had something. The tension on the plane was rising. He wasn't the only one who felt it. A few passengers in economy were shifting in their seats, sensing that something wasn't quite right. Flight attendants kept moving up and down the aisle, but there was an unease in their movements. Then the man in the suit stood up. Darius stiffened slightly but kept his face neutral. He watched as the man whispered something to Susan, who nodded before disappearing toward the cockpit. The man didn't return to his seat. Instead, he moved slowly, deliberately, toward the back of the plane. Darius followed him with his eyes, pretending not to notice. The man wasn't just stretching his legs. He was looking for something or someone. And then their eyes met. For a brief moment the man studied him. It wasn't a casual glance. It was sharp, assessing. Darius didn't look away. He held the man's gaze, calm but unshaken. Then, just as smoothly as he had walked back, the man turned and returned to first class. Darius exhaled slowly. Something was about to happen. His phone vibrated softly in his lap. Response. He picked it up, his stomach tightening as he read the message. "That's Richard Langley. He's bad news. Whatever's going on, get off that plane as soon as you land." Darius's heart pounded. Richard Langley. He had heard the name before, connected to powerful people, shady deals, and things pilots weren't supposed to ask about. But now Langley was on his flight. And he had made sure Darius wasn't sitting anywhere near him. Why? Darius's fingers tightened around his phone. He had to be careful. He had to be smart. Because whatever was coming next, he knew it wasn't going to be good. Darius's grip on his phone tightened as he read the message again. Richard Langley. Bad news. Get off the plane as soon as you land. His instincts had been right. Something wasn't just off. Something was seriously wrong. But why him? Why was he the one being moved? He glanced toward first class again, but Langley was already seated. His posture relaxed, as if he had nothing to worry about. Darius knew that kind of confidence came from power, the kind of power that made people like Susan follow orders without question. A quiet voice broke his thoughts. Captain Mitchell. He turned to see the younger flight attendant standing next to his row again, her hands gripping the drink tray tightly. She didn't look at him directly, but her voice was just loud enough for him to hear over the low hum of conversation. "You need to be ready," she whispered. Darius's stomach twisted. Ready for what? She set a plastic cup of water on his tray table, her movements careful, controlled. "Something's happening when we land," she said under her breath. "That's why they moved you back here. They didn't want you near the cockpit." Darius's breath slowed. "Who didn't?" She hesitated, then exhaled shakily. "I don't know exactly. But the moment you boarded, Langley said something to Susan, and suddenly she was scrambling to change your seat. The captain doesn't even know about it." "I think," she swallowed. "I think it has to do with the flight." Darius's mind raced. He had been on hundreds of flights, trained for emergencies, studied every possible scenario. But this was something different. Someone had gone out of their way to separate him from the controls. The only reason to do that was if something was about to happen to the plane. Darius kept his face neutral, but his pulse was hammering. If the captain didn't know, then that meant whatever was coming wasn't an official order. This was something off the books. He had to get ahead of it. He took a slow sip of water, thinking quickly. "Can you get me to the cockpit?" he asked quietly. The flight attendant's eyes darted around. She hesitated. "I don't know if that's a good idea. Susan is watching everything. And Langley, he has people. You're already on their radar." Darius clenched his jaw. If he couldn't get to the cockpit, he needed another plan. "Then tell me, what do you know about Langley?" She hesitated, then lowered her voice even more. "I heard him on the phone before takeoff," she whispered. "He said something about a change of plans. And then I heard him say your name." Darius's blood ran cold. His name. Langley hadn't just noticed him. He had planned for him. His mind snapped into focus. If Langley had power over the flight crew, if he had people watching, then whatever was happening wasn't just about him. It was about the entire plane. Darius exhaled slowly, his heart pounding. He didn't know exactly what Langley was planning, but he knew one thing for sure. They weren't supposed to land safely. And now the only question left was, how was he going to stop it? Darius felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His instincts had been screaming at him from the start, and now everything was coming to a head. Richard Langley knew his name. He had made sure Darius wasn't anywhere near the cockpit. And now, a flight attendant was confirming that something was going to happen before they landed. He forced himself to stay calm. Panic wouldn't help him now. He had to think like a pilot, like the man trained to handle emergencies at 35,000 feet. Darius leaned in slightly, keeping his voice low. Listen to me. If something happens, I need to be able to reach the cockpit. Can you help me? The flight attendant hesitated, her hands tightening around the tray. She glanced toward first class, then back at him. I'll try. She walked away, disappearing behind the curtain. Darius exhaled, glancing at the seatbelt light above him. Still on. They weren't descending yet, which meant he had time, but not much. Then the plane jolted. Not turbulence. Something else. Shift. Darius's hands gripped the armrests as murmurs filled the cabin. Some passengers looked up in confusion, but the engines still hummed, and the flight continued smoothly. But he knew that feeling. It wasn't normal. A few seconds later, Susan appeared, her expression tight. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We're experiencing some slight technical difficulties, but everything is under control. Everything was not under control. Darius glanced toward first class. Langley was still seated, looking unbothered, sipping from his glass like nothing had changed. Well, he was waiting. Darius's phone vibrated in his lap. A new message from his pilot friend. Just got more info. Langley has ties to aviation security. Whispers about test flights on commercial airlines. If he's on your flight, get off it. Darius's blood turned to ice. Test flights. He had heard of those before. Operations disguised as routine travel, meant to test vulnerabilities in security or aircraft systems. Some were official, others were something else. The plane jolted again, this time harder. A few passengers yelped. The tension in the cabin thickened. Darius knew what was happening now. Langley and his people weren't hijacking the plane. They were testing something on it. And if a test went wrong, that meant innocent lives were at risk. He unbuckled his seatbelt. A sharp voice stopped him. Sir remained seated. Susan. She was watching him now, standing just a few rows ahead. Her eyes weren't just giving orders. They were daring him to try. Darius looked past her. The curtain to first class. The cockpit beyond that. His mind calculated everything in seconds. He could do this. He had to do this. Then suddenly a voice crackled through the intercom. But it wasn't the captain. It was Langley. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Richard Langley speaking. I ask that you remain calm. Darius's stomach dropped. Langley had control of the intercom, which meant the cockpit had been compromised. Passengers started looking around in confusion. The murmurs turned into full voices, a rising panic. Darius didn't think. He moved. He lunged from his seat, pushing past Susan before she could react. A few passengers gasped, but he didn't stop. His feet pounded against the floor as he ran toward the front of the plane. Langley's voice continued, smooth and calculated. This flight is part of an important operation. If everyone cooperates, no harm will come to anyone. Darius reached the first-class curtain and yanked it aside. Langley was already rising from his seat, his calm mask cracking just slightly. Behind him, the cockpit door was closed. Darius didn't hesitate. He grabbed the nearest serving cart and slammed it into the door. The metal rattled on impact. Commotion broke out. Flight attendants rushed forward. Langley moved fast, reaching for something inside his jacket. But then the door unlocked. The younger flight attendant. She had done it. Darius shoved the door open and stormed inside. The sight made his heart lurch. The captain and co-pilot were slumped in their seats, unconscious. And standing between them was a man Darius didn't recognize, wearing a headset, his hands hovering over the controls. Darius didn't give him a chance to react. He grabbed the man by the collar and yanked him back, sending him crashing against the cockpit wall. The plane tilted. Darius barely caught himself as alarms blared. He threw himself into the pilot's seat, scanning the instruments. The autopilot had been disengaged. Someone had been overriding the system. His hands moved on instinct. Controls, altitude, engine power. He had to stabilize it now. Through the cockpit door he could hear shouts. Scuffle. Langley was losing control of whatever plan he had. Darius gritted his teeth and focused. The plane fought him at first, like an animal resisting a leash, but he had trained for this. He knew how to handle an aircraft in crisis. Slowly, steadily, he brought it back under control. A voice crackled through the radio. Flight 472, we've been receiving irregular data from your aircraft. Do you copy? Darius grabbed the radio. This is Captain Darius Mitchell. I'm taking control of this aircraft. The original flight crew has been incapacitated. I need emergency assistance upon landing. Silence. Copy that, Captain Mitchell. Stand by. Darius exhaled. He wasn't alone in this anymore. The fight behind him had gone quiet. He risked a glance back. Langley was on the floor, subdued by a few brave passengers. Darius turned back to the controls. He wasn't done yet. The hardest part was still ahead. But one thing was certain. Whatever Richard Langley had planned, he had just failed. Darius took a steadying breath, his hands firm on the controls. The plane was stable now, but his work wasn't done. He checked the navigation system. Only 30 minutes until landing. Air traffic control was already aware of the situation, and he knew emergency responders would be waiting on the ground. Behind him, the cabin had fallen into an uneasy silence. The chaos had died down, but tension still lingered in the air. Passengers who had bravely subdued Langley and his men were still watching him, wary of what he might do next. Flight attendants stood frozen, caught between following protocol and dealing with a situation they had never trained for. Langley sat on the floor, his hands restrained with makeshift zip ties. His suit was rumpled, and his calm demeanor had been replaced with something colder. He wasn't panicked. He wasn't pleading for release. He simply stared at Darius with a quiet, knowing smirk. Darius ignored him. Whatever Langley had planned, it was over. Now his only focus was getting everyone on this plane to safety. The younger flight attendant, the one who had risked everything to unlock the cockpit, stepped forward. Her voice was shaky but determined. Do you need anything? Darius nodded, keeping his eyes on the controls. I need you to reassure the passengers. Tell them everything is under control and that we're making an emergency landing. She hesitated, then quickly moved toward the intercom. Within moments, her voice filled the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your flight crew. The situation is under control. We are preparing for an emergency landing, but please remain calm and stay seated. The announcement seemed to ease some of the passengers, though nervous glances were still exchanged. Darius didn't blame them. They had been sitting in the middle of something terrifying, something most people never imagined happening on a flight. Darius adjusted the flaps and lowered the landing gear. The airport was in sight now, runway lights stretching out like a guiding path. Flight 472, you are clear for an emergency landing. Air traffic control confirmed over the radio. Darius inhaled deeply, steadying himself. This was it. The wheels touched the ground with a firm but controlled impact. The moment the plane slowed, the tension in the cabin cracked, passengers exhaling in relief. The emergency vehicles waiting on the tarmac rushed toward them. As soon as the plane came to a full stop, flight attendants moved quickly to open the doors. Emergency responders boarded, checking on the unconscious pilots first before moving toward Langley and his men. Langley didn't resist as he was lifted to his feet. Even as he was led away in handcuffs, that smirk never left his face. He turned slightly toward Darius as he passed. "Well done, Captain Mitchell," he said smoothly. "We'll meet again." Darius didn't respond. He simply watched as Langley was escorted off the plane, disappearing into the waiting arms of federal agents. The passengers slowly filed out, some glancing at Darius with gratitude, others still shaken by what had happened. A few muttered thank yous as they passed, and he nodded in return. Finally, the plane was empty except for the crew. Darius stood and stretched, feeling the weight of everything settle into his bones. The younger flight attendant lingered near the cockpit. "I can't believe we made it," she whispered. Darius gave a small, tired smile. "You helped make that happen," he said. "Thank you." She nodded, her eyes filled with something between relief and exhaustion. "What do you think Langley was really after?" Darius exhaled. "I don't know. But whatever it wasn't just about this flight. He was testing something. And I don't think this is the last we'll hear of him." Outside, the flashing lights of emergency vehicles lit up the night. Officials swarmed the tarmac, talking in hushed, urgent voices. Investigations would follow. Questions would be asked. But for now the flight was over. The passengers were safe. And Darius, he had done his job.